Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well. Let's get started. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at a couple things with economics, as well as we're going to look at globalization. And then your assignment today is going to be you need to look up like Google, right? So, like, what are some pros and what are some cons to globalization? I think you'll need 5 pros and 5 cons. So a little bit about economics, right? So I wanted to just talk about some of the different terms that go along with it. Super basic stuff. Okay, so first, production. So production is the action of making or manufacturing from components or raw materials. This is the process of being manufactured, right? So whenever we're looking at like factories and stuff, when you hear production, it's like that's where they're making this stuff, right? Consumption is the other side of that coin, which is that is where people are buying the goods and services. So production is making it, consumption is buying it and using it. Industrialization. So this is a word that you guys will hear a lot next year in world civilizations, especially with the Industrial Revolution. So industrialization is where we see development of industries in a country or region on a wide scale. So really we're seeing like an area go from farming, right, or logging, or we'll call them our primary economic sector, into more factory stuff, right? They're making stuff, they're building stuff. So we're looking at 3 sections of the economy. On your country comparison assignment with Africa from last time, so where you had to look up the 2 different countries, so there was the GDP by sector, and it had agriculture, I think like it just said factories and then services. So those are the same as these. So primary, secondary, tertiary. So our primary sector of the economy it's kind of like the closest to the earth, right? It's getting your raw materials. So primary sector things would be like mining for coal, mining for iron, mining for copper, growing tomatoes on a commercial scale, and growing wheat, right? So we're looking at like really big beef farms, so a lot of things like growing food, mining, logging, so cutting down trees to be made into like lumber, right? So that would all be primary, right? It's getting something pretty much straight from the earth. Secondary is where you take those resources, those natural resources, those raw goods, right? Like the trees that were cut down with logging, and then secondary takes them and cuts them into boards and pressure treats them or dries them out so that they can be used to build houses, right? Or secondary would be taking that raw copper that had been mined and refining it, and making it into wires for wiring in your house, right? Secondary could also be like the Farr's ice cream factory, where they're taking milk and sugar and things that are raw and mixing them together and making ice cream, right? So that would be secondary. Tertiary is where we see more services, so people working in like retail stores, cashiers, customer service, stuff like that. So they are providing a service. Bank tellers, right? That's a service. That's tertiary. Teachers, that's a service. Okay, so that would be in the tertiary part of the economy. And if you went into like a field that would go more into like economics and stuff like that, then you would have like your quaternary, which is like more like tech industry stuff, like computer coding and stuff like that. But for this class, we're just looking at these 3, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And with these, so our less developed countries will be mostly focused on their primary stuff. So they're looking at just like getting those natural resources that they have. Mostly, that's what their economy's based in. Our developing will be mostly in the secondary, and then our most developed countries will be, most of their stuff will be in the tertiary. And that doesn't mean, right, the United States has a lot of farms, right, lots of stuff in the primary sector, but the majority of our stuff's still in the tertiary. Okay, so you can still have percentages in the other ones, but yeah. This is the United States labor force. So this kind of reddish color is primary workers, the blue is secondary, and the yellow is tertiary. And we look at the different years. So at first we started out with like a lot of the labor force doing primary work, right? And then over time, right, that primary shrinks and the other two grow. And then the tertiary grows even more. And then, when you guys were born roughly, tertiary is 81% of the U.S. labor force. So, right, that shows, right, at first over here, you could say 1850, so we were a less developed country in a way, and then the Industrial Revolution happens, right, and we're developing right here, and developing into most developed and the most developed. Mass production has also been a game changer. So with things like the assembly line, right, we can produce large quantities, large amounts of something by an automated mechanical process. So things like shoes, right, or I don't know, the laptop I'm staring at, or my microphone, right? So they were probably all mass produced, right? Location theory also deals with businesses. So this is about like where to put your business, right? So let's say you want to start a business. Where is the best place to put your business? There's a lot of factors that go into it, but location theory addresses the questions of what economic activities are located where and why, as well as like optimum location. So optimum location, like the best place you can have your business, is where you have the lowest production costs and the lowest shipping costs, right? So if I'm making keychains, right, I want to have my factory that makes keychains where it's cheapest to make them, right, but also the cheapest to ship them where they need to go. So this is a map that shows iron deposits, iron ore, and coal deposits in the eastern United States. Traditionally, steel is made with coal, iron, and limestone, right? So, based off of this, like, where would you put your steel manufacturing plant, right? Probably, it's like, okay, well, what's the hardest to ship? Is it harder to ship coal? Is it harder to ship iron? Where's the, limestone? Stuff like that, right? And then you have to figure out, okay, well, where do they need steel, right? So, a lot of places where they make steel, my mind is blanking on the word, but places where they make, right, steel and stuff like that end up being up in here around Chicago, Michigan, that kind of area. Steel, right, if you're interested, right, so like I said from the other one, right, a lot of those factories up in here, right, so the red are steel, right, so that makes sense, right, so they're right next to the coal deposits and the iron deposits. Here's another one to kind of show steel industry and then some of the major railroads connecting them, as well as like canals, which is how they ship everything, right, on the railroads and canals. All right. The Maquiladora zone. So this is where we have a lot of factories in Mexico. I should have capitalized that. Whoops. that are right across the border from the United States. So, right, the border of the United States, if you cross it into Mexico, most of that is desert, right? It's not a great place to live. It's hot, it's dry, not much out there, but there's a lot of cities and a lot of factories right along the U.S. border. So it's like, well, why? First thing is, my dog is having the zoomies. Oh, she stopped. So minimum wage in Mexico and border states in 2019. So in 2019, minimum wage in California was $12 an hour. Arizona was 11, New Mexico 7.5, Texas 7.25. The federal minimum wage was $7.25, so it was the same in Utah. If you look in Mexico, most of Mexico is roughly 60 US cents, right, per hour, and northern Mexico is $1 an hour, $1.10 an hour. So first off, right, so say I need to make factory, right? Where is it going to be cheaper for me to have my stuff produced? Well, labor cost goes into that, right? So am I going to have my keychains made in California? Probably not, because I have to pay my workers a lot more, which goes into production cost, right, and raises that cost. So maybe I have in Texas, but then I'm like, well, what the heck, why don't I just do it in Mexico, right? So across the border. So if you go further south, if I had my factory further south in like near Mexico City, labor is going to be even cheaper, but I have to ship it further. So right along the northern border of Mexico, right, even though it's more expensive than the rest of Mexico, right, as far as like labor costs go, it's still a lot cheaper than the United States. And so we see a lot of factories in those areas. So something to kind of think about, right? It's like, okay, well, production costs is labor costs plus shipping costs, right? They're along the border of the United States because it's easier to ship them across the border. And then usually I have people who are like, what's the minimum wage in the rest of the states? So you can pause this video or whatever if you want to look at this, but it's 2019 minimum wage. The darker the blue, the higher it is. And then just so you know, too, different cities can also have different minimum wages. Like I know in Washington, Seattle has a higher minimum wage than the rest of Washington. And then this is the most lucrative food crop in each state. Meaning it's like what's gonna make you the most rich if you farm it. So that's kind of fun too. All right, globalization. So what is globalization? How does it impact culture? That's kind of your essential question. So what is globalization? So here are 3 different definitions of globalization. Okay, and they're all different. So the first one, globalization in its simplest form means a more connected world. Okay, well, that doesn't tell me a ton, but okay. Globalization is the movement and integration of goods and people among different countries. Okay. And globalization is driven by international trade and aided by information technology. All right, so I'm going to try and explain it a little bit better than those. So globalization is having trade between different countries, right? So it's a trade of ideas, it's a trade of money, it's a trade of goods, it's a trade of food, right? It's a trade of information, okay? So it's trading things with other countries on the global scale, all right? So my one example, right? This is my stapler. I bought it when I was in college for like $2 because it was on sale. So that was the thing. It's a nice stapler. I really like it. And it was made in China. Okay. So the stapler was made in China. This is an example of globalization. I have a jacket that was made in Bangladesh, right? That's an example of globalization, right? It was made somewhere else. Right? And so it's like, oh, great, cool. You know, we're trading with other countries. We're helping other countries that are less developed get more money, get rich, right? Stuff like that. So pros and cons of globalization, these are like kind of like some questions to think about. So is it the integration of economic globalization, definition, political and cultural system? What? I don't know why that sentence doesn't make sense to me when I typed it. Is it the integration of economic globalization, definition, political and cultural systems across the globe, or is it dominance of developed countries in decision making at the expense of poorer, less powerful nations? So what that's getting at is, sometimes when businesses have factories and stuff in other countries, you know, it's because labor's cheaper, right? And there's the whole question of, is that right? Right? Should those people be making less money? The second thing is sometimes companies like to cut corners, and there's like lots of illegal factories and like safety concerns. You know, factories not having the right safety equipment, stuff like that, because they're in less developed countries. Sorry, think about that. Is globalization a force for economic growth, prosperity, and democratic freedom? So an argument for globalization is, you know, trading and buying things and paying people in less developed countries spurs economic growth. The more money that they have, the more money they spend, the more their economy grows. Or is it a force for environmental devastation, exploitation of the developing world, and suppression of human rights? Environmental devastation, so a lot of countries will do things like slash and burn stuff for like large crops, like to plant palm trees for palm oil, right? They'll cut away the rainforest, burn it down, and then plant what they want. Or in Brazil, a big thing is like beef. So they cut down the rainforest and create pasture land for the cows, right? So no more rainforest, but now there's cows. And then they sell that beef on the international market to other countries. And then does globalization only benefit the rich, or can the poor take advantage of it to improve their well-being, right? That's another thing to think about. And there's a video from National Geographic. You can click the slideshow on today's like page and go to that if you wanted to watch that. But it's from National Geographic. It's about globalization, right? And so normally if we were like physically in class, we'd have a whole Socratic seminar or fishbowl discussion, right, where you would have to come up with questions, look up pros and cons, and then make your argument whether you think globalization is a good or bad thing. You know, globalization became a really big debate topic in the early 2000s when you guys were born. It's stayed a pretty big topic since then. Every now and then you'll hear it come up with like presidential debates and all that fun stuff. But like I said, your assignment for today is look up 5 pros and 5 cons to globalization, and then you just copy and paste them in there, and there you go. Okay. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. See ya.